My wife Kelly and I want to welcome all of you to this, the 13th annual Maitra Lecture, and it's going to be a wonderful evening. This has been one of the most popular events on campus since its inception, because we've brought stellar international speakers to come to UC Santa Cruz and stimulate our thinking process. Our inaugural Maitra lecturer was Vikram Seth. But since then, we've had Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen, recently doctor, writer, and Stanford professor Abraham Verghese, and we've even had our own Professor Sandy Faber, who won the 2013 National Medal of Science from President Obama. So this is the culminating event of our Founders Celebration. And its theme today, its theme this year is creativity and innovation in the arts. And as you will see, we couldn't have chosen a better speaker today to manifest that scheme. But this entire lecture series is the result of one woman's vision, Anu Luther. Anu has spent many years working for this campus and even on this campus. She's been a trustee of our UC Santa Cruz Foundation since the year 2000, and she was president of the foundation board from 2005 to 2007. And another service she gave to the campus is she served on the Chancellor's Search Committee 7 years ago, which meant something to me. But one of her major contributions is that she established and endowed the Sidhartha Maitra Memorial Lecture Series. Her latest role on campus is I recently asked her to step in and be a special advisor to the Chancellor on international initiatives. She's going to work with us to enhance our campus's global visibility, build strategic international partnerships, and support student and faculty exchange programs. I think she's going to make a huge difference for this campus. So it is with great pleasure that I ask you to welcome Anu Luther.
Hello, and welcome to, indeed, the 13th annual Sidhartha Maitra Memorial Lecture. A special welcome to Chancellor George Blumenthal and Chancellor Rena Kelly Weisberg, and to Donna Murphy. I think that's what you'll be called, Kelly, from now on. I just thought that was a nice name. But and to Donna Murphy, who recently retired as Vice Chancellor of University Relations. She has been instrumental in supporting and helping shape this series, ably assisted by Anne McCrow, Foundation Director, herself very ably assisted by Nikki Torres, Christine Palmer, and my very own Rebecca Alvarez. Thank you all. I am Anu Maitra, who was devastated by the sudden loss of her husband that many years ago, and who established the series along with friends Kiran and Arjun Malhotra. Today, I'm also very happy to acknowledge in the audience my husband of exactly 1 week, Thomas Kailath. And the man who came from Israel to marry us, Freddie Brookstein, who is here with his wife, Rita, and son, Ariel. True, the genesis of the series was grief, an attempt to keep alive the memory of a remarkable man. But over the years, it has gradually, almost imperceptibly, morphed into one where the ideas and ideology presented are its raison d'etre. Our topics have ranged from Islam in California to the dharma of capitalism, globalism and terrorism to nuclear weapons and world peace, global warming, the tyranny of identity, Satyajit Ray's reality shows. Admittedly, these are all pressing contemporary issues, but I believe that the success of our series comes from the choice of speakers known for their unusually clever angles and lighting techniques that they use in the practice of their craft. Well, what is an opera, theater, and festival director doing in this group? The truth is that Anne McCrow suggested his name, arguing that the year's Founders' Day theme was creativity, innovation, and the arts, and that Peter would make a compelling speaker. He's one of the most innovative and powerful forces in the performing arts in America and abroad. He has ushered in the age of what is now known as contemporary opera, almost defined the term, I would say. He has reinterpreted the classics, written and staged his own works, collaborated with others, notably John Adams, to produce intensely zany, intimate, urgent opera in shades not seen before. And what is amazing, that his Mozart's Da Ponte series, Nixon in China, Handel's Theodora, have so quickly become mainstream classics. A few examples, and only a few. He's irrepressibly prolific. A friend told me about his student production of Antony and Cleopatra, set in the swimming pool of Harvard's Adams House. I recall this production vividly for its imagination and chaotic energy. The famous barge scene was enacted in the pool with Cleopatra on some kind of float and Antony calling out to her from the diving board. Mozart's The Da Ponte operas, Don Giovanni was set in an urban ghetto, Così fan tutti in a diner, Marriage of Figaro in a corporate high-rise. Kafka fragments. The libretto was Georgi Kurtag's song cycle from soprano and violin, interspersed with extracts from Kafka's writing. The Indian Queen, a pastiche. He took Henry Purcell's 1695 opera, replaced John Dryden's libretto with one based on Nicaraguan writer Rosario Aguilar's novel set in the Peruvian and Mexican courts just before the Spanish invasion. Wonders are many. The Making of Dr. Atomic. He created 4 poetry libretto as a composite of writings by John Donne and Baudelaire, and from the Bhagavad Gita, and a book on the military uses of atomic energy. And the shirts and the beads and the smile were irresistible. I was already taken with the spectacle. But then I started reading about Peter's philosophy on nothing less than the meaning of life. One of the hardest things for me to deal with about the 20th century is that it was so absorbed in psychology and the self. And that is to devalue your place in history, what we're all here doing here for each other. Individuals working together, doing something that is beyond your individual self, lifts everyone to a new place. Love cannot be a mere abstraction without activity. And I quickly realized that the works themselves are profound reflections on war and famine and poverty, the plight of immigrants and refugees, the possibility of nuclear annihilation, the missing voice of women in historical narratives. His concerns truly are nothing else than the fate of humanity. He's obviously a stunningly versatile global citizen. In a program in which he was allowed to bring his favorite music, he was asked to bring his favorite music, he played Rokia Traore from Mali, who's collaborating with Toni Morrison for one of his works, the Afghan Rubab, played by Humayun Saki, the orchestra Baobab from Cuba, the gospel music of Sam Cooke and the Soul Stirrers. And I saw that Peter's methodology was the same as that of my product designer son, who is also here in the audience today, who has strenuously sought to educate me that form without function is meaningless, that the most pleasing forms are those that are critical to, almost define the function. Science, the Industrial Revolution, globalization have brought to us an unprecedented prosperity, but also created many of the aforementioned problems. The internet revolution in communications may have numbed us through overexposure. They may not contain in themselves the logic or the capacity to find the solutions. For me now, it isn't that Peter is an artist who wants to do important things. He wants to do important things, therefore he is an artist. And in this context, innovativeness, Peter's innovativeness and creativity, even outrageousness, are essential techniques to capture our attention, draw our gaze of love, as he calls it, to what is missing, to write a collective history from the point of view of the most disenfranchised. His manic, intense method has an important engineering efficiency to it. 23 seconds to contain 50 ideas. Peter is a teacher, but also a professor at UCLA. He teaches inspired, exuberantly creative classes in art as moral action, art as social action, seeking to inspire students with the relevance of culture in finding solutions to society's pressing problems, asking artists to show up and speak up. One of his favorite concepts, techniques, is the concept of duality. I saw this theme repeated often in comments, somewhat paraphrased, such as, the finest expression of love is found in the absence of the loved one, expressed as longing. Death is the best guarantee against wasting time during your life. It is the quest for what is missing on the canvas that gives birth to the finest paintings. Thus, I was not surprised to learn from him that he started on a spiritual journey at 21 as he sat on the banks of the Ganges at Varanasi, or that he had been studying for more than 20 years the great Buddhist treatise Vimalakirti Sutra, a discourse on the dharma door of non-duality. The idea there is that since every concept needs an opposite in order to have a meaning, dharma is expressed to seekers in terms of pairs of opposites. But in the experience of an absolute reality, all duality is transcended, including that between duality and non-duality. So let us then imagine that we are all bodhisattvas, people who seek enlightenment, gathered here in the gardens of Amrapali. We each bring with us a bejeweled parasol, our own, but miraculously, all parasols merge into one gigantic canopy over us, uniting us in our worldview. The veteran bodhisattva, Peter, motivated by great compassion, perfect mindfulness, intelligence, and eloquence, is going to take us into a Buddha field, a pure manifestation of wisdom. I have already learned from him to focus on meaning, not literal expression. But one thing he's not permitted to do is to teach the ultimate dharma of non-duality, which would require him to say nothing, explain nothing, pronounce nothing, indicate nothing, designate nothing. Only then would we face the articulate, significant silence of enlightenment. But it would be silence nevertheless. I give to you Peter SELLARS in the hope that he will not remain silent for the next 40 minutes.
That is beyond belief.
Oh my God. It's just shocking. Oh my God. That is unbelievable, Anu. Thank you. My God, excuse me. No, I will share a bejeweled parasol with you anytime. Hello, enlightened beings and mavens of culture. How thrilling to be here. I am shocked to say I have never been to Santa Cruz in my life until tonight. I'm sorry, I am not a cultured person. And so for me, Santa Cruz has just been this legend, this imaginary place forever where all these people are doing astounding work and, you know, everywhere else is so straight and stuck up and freaked out. And finally, Santa Cruz, people are willing to think freely and interact. What a thrill. Can I just say there are so many people here tonight who I admire for so many years. I hope we get to talk, and I need to come back. And so, may I just say one thing early on? We have brilliant young people armed with microphones, right? Identify yourselves, genius people. Well, they're somewhere. Microphones are down front. Oh, right. Okay, so here you have a self-serve operation, but we will not just cater to the self. As Anu says, let's just get beyond that. And what I'm going to ask is people should just interrupt me at any time. Because there's a lot of things we can all talk about, and I can talk about a lot of things, but I'd like to talk about things that are specifically of interest to people here. Is that cool? And so stop me before I kill again. When you interrupt, don't just make me cry. You know, be polite. You know, say, Mr. Sellars, what you just said is resounding bullshit, but could I ask you to be more precise? But just because, again, the more into dialogue we are, the better. As Anu says, it's bizarre, I'm known for doing opera. It's not that I'm particularly obsessed with opera. It's that opera is the art form which is collaborative. It is a collaborative, shared space. And for me, the important project of the 21st century is how do we share space? How do we share the water? How do we share the air? How do we share? How do we actually identify, protect, and sacralize shared space and honor that which is shared? And go out of our way to create structures that insist upon sharing and get past the kind of level of scholarship I was brought up with where there was one single genius who was the expert in the field. Thank God the world has changed. Nobody can claim to be on top of any field anymore, thank God. But also knowledge itself is composite and collective. And in fact is held by communities, not individuals. And that's what's so powerful. And the more we can demonstrate these structures and this dynamic that moves past the individual genius and goes into a shared dynamic where not only something spoken can be articulated, but that which cannot be spoken can be articulated. And so for me, this shared space is very crucial because many fields are limited by language, are inspired by language, but also limited, which is one of the reasons we have to push language to the place where it becomes poetry, where it touches something that's infinite, and where we constantly have to remind ourselves of the presence of infinity in extremely limited sets of data, and not simply get used to the tyranny of, or as my friend Ananda Kumaraswamy says, the superstition of facts. facts are only for the very superstitious who are busy reading into things in ridiculous ways. How do we get to the place where the fact is elevated to poetry and where we move through the particular and through the human, but also touch the divine in ourselves and in each other? That role is particularly powerfully embodied in the arts. And I'm really proposing the arts tonight as a kind of climax to your gala sequence of celebrations. I want to describe the arts in two ways tonight, very briefly, but just, I hope, usefully. One is the arts are not about the arts at all and never were. You're interested in art because you're interested in everything else. And art is a way to get closer to things than you're usually allowed to get. And art is a way to liberate the thinking, behavior patterns, habit energies of any field. But art by itself doesn't exactly exist. It's actually there to liberate everything else. And so for me, this era of art for art's sake is one of the most intellectually and spiritually sterile periods in the history of art. And you see the results are sad until the last decade, where artists are more and more and more turning themselves into making things useful. And now the current research is that arts graduates are the highest employed graduates of any universities in the last 5 years. If you want to have a future, be an artist, because you're trained in creative problem solving. And you're trained in how to do something a better way, a new way, a different way. And you're trained to look at things differently. And you're trained to have a good time. To not just associate bad feeling with everything you do. Amazing. But to actually say any of this without pleasure is not acceptable. And in fact, the great thing that enlivens and awakens all of us as human beings is pleasure. And where you do your best thinking, where your eyes light up, where connections are made, is in a state of pleasure, not in a state of puritanical self-hatred. And so, I know this is shocking in academia, but you know, so I'm going to really propose one thing. I just want to clue you guys into an initiative I'm beginning at UCLA that I just want to describe to you a little bit, which is about housing the arts in an interdisciplinary manner, which obviously you're doing here rather brilliantly. And I just want to propose a couple of thoughts in that direction. And then as an example, working example, I want to deal with the food movement and deal with food as culture. You know, because Bill Clinton finally even admitted, you know, they got that one wrong. They thought that food was like color television sets, you know, a commodity. It is not. It is culture. And because India is the subject matter of these lectures traditionally, I just want to emphasize that India has taught us deeply about food, not as a commodity. In the old Maharaja system, there was not food at the market. Everybody ate, and it wasn't a question of money. We talk about subsistence farming. And when I was going to high school, it was like, oh, those poor people. Actually, it's looking like a very good idea. What it means to have a footprint that is that light. and what it means to create plenty modestly. And I'd like to talk about Indian agriculture and Indian culture together. And I'd like everybody to interrupt me whenever possible, please. Great. Let me just say very, very quickly, the initiative that I want to start at UCLA, and I'm saying this just to be complimentary to John Weber here, it's called the Boethius Initiative. Now, does everyone know who Boethius was? No, probably not. Some people do, thank God. And the rest of you don't, because this is what's going to make this evening memorable. Boethius was a really interesting philosopher from 5th century Rome. And anybody who knows who he is, ignore what I'm about to say. And as you know, 5th century Rome was famous for being quite decadent. It was extremely decadent. It was democracy at a very low ebb, where, you know, very wealthy people stuck their fingers into everything, and there was no integrity of any kind in public life. I know this is, use your imaginations. You know, project yourself into another historical period, please. And so at this time, one of the last Roman emperors was appointed, and as they sat around the White House, they said, okay, things are pretty depressing. We need to raise the moral tone here. What if we hired a great moral philosopher to be chief of staff? Wouldn't that lift the tone around here? So they did. They called up this guy, Boethius. Now, Boethius is a philosopher who I particularly love, first of all, because he wrote 6 books of the philosophy of music. And he understood that music is philosophical. That, again, what we learn from India is everything has meaning. And it's the meaning that's important. Beings are more important than things. Boethius moved in those deep waters of the philosophy of music. And his other life project was to reconcile Greek and the new Christian culture in Rome. Because, of course, Roman civilization was based on Greek culture and then suddenly had been Christianized. So either we had to have massive pogroms, or somebody had to say this culture and this other culture should be allowed to coexist. And actually, if you look very, very, very deeply, this culture is making the same gesture as this other culture. It just takes a different form. And this incredible action of trying to say we don't actually have to kill all these people because they're different, but we can actually recognize sameness inside the difference if we ask ourselves more deeply about motives and deeper purposes. So his project was to Christianize all of Greek culture without doing violence. He picked up the phone. He said, "You want me to come to the White House?" "Sure, I'm happy to come over." Very flattered. He showed up, and his first staff meeting, after a while, he just had to interrupt and say, "Oh, excuse me, it would not be correct to take those people's homes away from them." Yeah, thank you. Then he had to interrupt a little later and say, "Well, actually, you shouldn't arrest these people because, you know." After a while, it became very annoying having a moral philosopher around the office. You know, it was just impossible to get anything done. But they had already gone too far, and he knew too much. So they had to disappear him. And so they just put him in a very deep dungeon where he would never see daylight again. And then after a while, they were very annoyed that he was still around because it just bothered them in the back of their minds. So they went down to the dungeon with giant clubs and they beat him into putty. And he was dead. And they were relieved. Now, in those months in that dungeon, he wrote his last book, I don't know if it was smuggled out on toilet paper. And the book is called The Consolation of Philosophy. And in this book, philosophy, the goddess philosophy, who is a woman, walks through the walls of his cell and sits down on his bed with him. And they sing songs together about the nature of justice. Across the chapters, it goes from the justice of day-to-day issues we have with each other. But she does not indulge his self-pity. She says, excuse me, it's just the wheel of fortune. You had no problem when the wheel was up there. So you have no right to complain just because you're down there, because you bought into the wheel. Gradually it goes up to this Pythagorean harmony of the universe, and as Martin Luther King said, the universe bends towards justice, the way in which justice is inscribed in the cosmos. That's the last song. This book, 5 centuries later, was the most copied manuscript in the Middle Ages. And it could be found in every monastery, every university. 15 centuries later, it is the only book written in the 5th century that you can get in paperback. So for me, Boethius is a very important image of, first of all, one of the great works of prison literature. And just say, what do we have to hear from people who the world thought they had silenced? At this moment, there are people in maximum security locked down who have everything to say to the world, while the world just, the free world is allowed to continue shopping. What does it mean to place a microphone in some of those deep, deeply inaccessible places where people have been buried alive? And meanwhile, what does it mean that one era thought it had silenced something, but of course, 5 centuries later, that's the only voice that is still remaining. All other voices have been extinguished. Because that's how culture works. Culture is more interesting than politics. Politics, the same person has the microphone forever. Culture, the microphone changes hands in surprising ways. And somebody who was not previously thought to be important, several centuries later, becomes a window for all of humanity and a mirror. The idea of the Boethius Initiative is I want to create a space for artists, scholars, activists, to create new vocabulary and new imagery for the American voter. Most people are voting based on images and phrases and words that are not only out of date, but have been deliberately crafted to misrepresent the subject. And so how do you get past describing something as non-Western? Okay, thank you. It's helpful to know it's not Western. Now, what would it be? Hello? Could we do better? I think we could. Could we begin to reorient and redirect our vocabularies and our image world and our sound world in a way that created a much more open and dynamic democracy? Obviously, we're in a very bizarre situation where neither party is allowed to say anything that has any truth content of any kind. So what would it be to introduce truth content but truth content that could actually be tested and verified in experience. In other words, how do we escape the tyranny of ideology and move into a place where there's an experiential quality to what we're trying to touch, which is what artists do, is create something that's palpable, visceral, that you engage with the deepest part of your senses and the deepest part of your soul. That creates something that mobilizes, that inspires, that shifts, that creates a different way to think or recognize something, or actually turns you around completely. Oh my God, yes, please come take this beautiful microphone from Josh. Josh, go!
Hello, can you
tell me your name?
My name's Clarissa.
Clarissa, it's so beautiful to see you tonight. Hello.
Thank you. Hi. I was just wondering, but don't you think that art in our contemporary society is also being commodified and sold and packaged in a way that plays into non-creativity, like in a way they're using creativity to kind of do everything that we've, I don't know.
And who? Somebody's adding something to that.
I said that's because art is now the blue chip investment in the way the economy.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
yes, yes,
So
yes, yes.
Is it, because you mentioned earlier art, creativity for creativity's sake, and I mean, is that the case? Like, is that what's going on nowadays? That's something I've always wondered. Because, I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with street artists, but, you know, they've become kind of like this whole branded thing now, and street art had its foundations in like illegality and like anti-system, but yet you can find street artist art on t-shirts sold at Target for $20. Like, what does that mean for art nowadays?
Well, it means that some of them can feed their kids.
That's true.
But,
Totally.
you know, it's an interesting thing. I mean, you know, again, to me, please let, Clarissa, thank you so much. Please note that I'm trying to use words like dynamic. I'm trying not to describe a situation that's stuck, that is this or that. And as gorgeous Anu mentioned earlier, I'm really into getting past the duality to this amazing place where one thing can support its opposite in a positive way, in which, in fact, the yin-yang is exactly what's needed to make a working system. And if we have nothing but a bunch of yin piled up over there and no yang to be found, we're in trouble. And so what I'm trying to do is get a dynamic that actually, again, allows the art world to escape from its ideological constraints, right? Because art, even the worst art, and there's a lot of it, I mean, at any given moment, there's a 90% foil factor, right? 90% of the art made at any time is horrible. And there's just some art that's interesting, if you can find it. But you can't blame art, because art is just a mirror of the society. And so art is just showing you something. You can't just blame the messenger, because art is also constantly reflecting a state. So even the art I hate is actually testifying to something very powerfully. And you have to hear the testimony, not just hate the art, right? And you have to say, okay, this is a signal. This is a message, right? And Coomaraswamy, who I now have to discuss. I mentioned Coomaraswamy earlier, Ananda Coomaraswamy. I'll come back to Boethius, but you just have to know one other patron saint of this evening. And Ananda Coomaraswamy is the great Indian art historian in Gandhi's generation. He, like Gandhi, was educated a lot in the West and spent this time being extra British, and then going back to India and Ceylon, as it was called at that time, Sri Lanka, and being more Indian than anyone there. And they were all trying to be British. And so he was one of those marvelous figures that explained one side to the other. But he was also this uncompromising, fierce, fierce man who insisted on, you know, that the history of Western art had been in a 500-year decline since the Middle Ages. And he kept insisting that we have to look at art completely differently, and India has taught us how to look at art, which is art is something that actually makes life illuminated and alive and is useful. And that only in the West, where we got used to doing work that was stupid, not fulfilling, meaningless, and soul-destroying, was there a need for a vacation. But that in fact, the purpose of work was meant to be fulfilling, soulful. Everybody here knows the Hegel table story, right? Okay, very simple. In the old days, you knew a friend who made tables and chairs. And you said, would you please make a table for me and my girlfriend or my boyfriend or my daughter? You know her, you know how wonderful she is, you've known her for years, make a table for her. So your friend makes a table for the person you love, and it has that love in it. And there's no table on earth like that table. And your friend thinks of your daughter while he's making that table or while she's making that table, and it becomes this thrilling project that gives meaning to the table maker's life. And the table maker engages in creativity. And his work or her work is fulfilling. In the end, you get this beautiful table that forever reminds you of your daughter. Forever reminds you of people you love, forever has in it, embodies this kind of hearthstone of everything you care about and everything you hope for in life. Cut to IKEA. Where nobody makes a table. Ever. You're allowed to make table legs or table tops. But no employee ever actually makes a complete table. No table has any trace of any employee in any way. The work is mind-numbing, soul-destroying, repetitive, and mindless. In fact, to work in that table factory erases this person's identity. Every table they make erases this person from the earth. And you go to IKEA and buy that table, and it's able to erase you and your daughter at the same time. Because everybody who comes into contact with that table is no longer a person, but they are as depersonalized as the table is. And so what we have in the world is more things, but the things are stripped of meaning, stripped of beauty, stripped of any purpose other than being a table. And the table that you eat around with your family, you want to have something deeper than just a horizontal plane. It wants to be a gathering place. It wants to have this powerful, creative, emotional life. So what does it mean to give meaning to work? Do I hear from somebody up there?
I have a question about the soul people, so it comes to you now.
Can you give, we're going to let you get the mic because the webcast is dying to hear you say this, and you have to tell me your name also.
So my name's Ann Hayes. I work here at UCSC.
Hi, Ann.
I have an undergrad degree in philosophy, and I remember a little bit of Heidegger. And there was one essay we read at the college I went to about how things become beautiful through use. And that's always something I've believed. So IKEA gives you a table that doesn't have any soul, but perhaps through using it, you give it one.
Some wise person said, I don't think it lasts that long. I think I can let that rest. You know, obviously you can give anything a soul, but But that's an action, right, that you have to really engage with. All I'm just trying to say is we're surrounded by these really empty things. And the world has been made safe for things and really unsafe for people. Because our priority has been things at the expense of people. And sorry. Say that one more time. We're going to run up there. Oh my God, this is an athletic night. I think you're inspiring me also to go to the heights.
There you go.
You're talking about things being so important, and you started out talking about sharing, and then you're talking about the soulless table. I'm thinking that the soulless table is our modern way of sharing in this huge populace. It's almost impossible not to share on such a superficial level. But my question was, is in regards to the things, is that why in 2013 they added the definition for hoarding to the DSM?
I can see that people are quite culturally informed here in Santa Cruz. I am going to come at this another angle. Let me just polish off one thing that's dangling there very quickly, the Boethius initiative, where I mentioned that I really hope to create an interdisciplinary space which invites artists, scholars, activists to collaborate together around topics that are usually grotesquely misrepresented, such as the drug war. And what I want to do is involve a university and the word universe in the word university. And I want a 360-degree picture of the drug war, from international relations, from law, from economics. International relations, what does it mean when you push the drugs one more country over? What does it mean when you defoliate another country? Economics, what does it mean it's the second largest economy on the planet, but a black economy? Can we move, obviously, through understanding what drugs do to consciousness, through the neurosciences? Can we understand the chemical properties? Can we have the anthropology department weigh in with drugs not as antisocial, but as profoundly social in many societies? And can we have, finally, the English department testify that most English literature was written on drugs? And can we begin to get more real about all of these things? Because everybody knows that the drug war is a series of not only half-truths, but out-and-out lies. And as always, prohibition only lasted, didn't get past a decade, and people said, this is a disaster. What's different? At the end of prohibition, we knew what was going on, right? Because the drug war, in the 50 years since the Nixon administration that invented it as a way to roll back the civil rights movement, 3 times more drugs come into America now than 50 years ago. That's the amazing success of the drug war. What? Excuse me? Can we say that again? 3 times more drugs come into America now, 50 years later. That's the success of the war on drugs. So who is it a success for? Obviously, like prohibition, the cops. Huge money is being made. This has to end. I want to honor the prison projects here. At Santa Cruz, may I please honor the prison projects. But what does it mean to unwind the prison madness? We have to start at the drug war. And we have to dismantle it brick by brick. But every lie that props it up has to be turned around. With expertise, with testimony, with examples, and with startling clarity, which is what a university is for, is to get precise, to become accurate, to insist on a certain truth quotient. And a public university is here to educate the public. And that is our role. So for me, it's about giving the university a very public face and a very public involvement, which is what the arts can do, is to be public. At the moment, because of a certain bizarre series of, issues in intellectual history, most of the most impressive research at the moment is expressed in forms that are incomprehensible to the American voter, and therefore has failed to become part of the national consciousness. How do we rescue ourselves from the nightmare of Baudrillard and this idea that just as Ronald Reagan said that intellectuals had no place in public life, and the New York Times used the word intellectual as a pejorative regularly, that we ourselves, the intellectuals, began to speak to each other in a language that was incomprehensible to the rest of our fellow man. That's serious. That is a crisis. It is a social crisis. It's a political crisis. And it's a moral disaster. And so, path-breaking research has to be presented in a way that is comprehensible, that it becomes part of public awareness. And for me, this is a role of the arts. And how do we translate images, vocabulary, sound, movement, this incredible content of the last 30 years of research? That's the assignment I want to give artists. I want the artists to have to, for once, know what they're talking about, and constantly have to be up against serious intellectuals and researchers who know their stuff. And meanwhile, I want the artists to insist that these ideas not remain ideas, and that we find a way that we can inhabit this new world that the research, in fact, is pointing us to. So, the idea is to bring artists and scholars together and let projects happen across 3 or 5 years, to create a working group, to create student groups around that and through that, graduate students running everything, and actually, again, help one branch of education move into a very practical public mode, and actually have the next generation of scholars have practice in public presentation, and insist that research has a public dimension. Yes. Oh, here comes the beautiful microphone coming right here. Oh my God, yes.
Hi, my name is Julia Armstrong-Zwart.
How great you're here.
And what you're really, it seems to me you're talking about, the University of California is a land grant institution, and you are talking about a reimagined land grant mission for the 21st century, and I compliment you.
Thank you so much. I didn't want to use land grant, but that's it. Yeah. That is totally it. Let's make land grant real. Right. Let's get real about that. That is our birthright, so go for it. And deal with it. Bless you, thank you. That is the idea. And the idea is also to insist that students get into the habit of testing theory experientially. Because for me, this is very much missing over and over and over again. And it's one of the reasons why in my classes, I privilege athletes. Be right there. I privilege athletes in my classes because I feel in the student body, the athletes are holding themselves to the highest standards and are dealing with moral issues actually much more regularly than the rest of the student body, and have to constantly, are not allowed to be delusional because you are constantly measuring where you are and what you're really accomplishing. And there's a limit to the delusion. And that's impressive for me. And there's a certain type of truth-telling in the athletics department which is actually appealing and could actually wash over into other things, I think, very, very positively. And it's also cool to get athletes in the same room as choreographers and filmmakers and have them realize that a lot of things they do every day could be considered expressive, which they've never considered. And that is a very, very exciting dynamic. Anyway, just to say, this is the thumbnail of what I'm proposing, but you get the idea, and it's using the university as the collaborative space in the middle of society, and using the arts as the cynosure, as the safe zone inside a university that lets all of the other departments interact. Because everybody's willing to do something if it's an art project. You know, and why? That's a very important reason why. Because all of us are trapped in these nightmare identities that have nothing to do with who we really are, what we want to be, or what we're interested in. And the arts give you a permission to step out of your established identity and try something else. And to open yourself into all the other things that you are. Now, maybe I'll give one very concrete example of this. I did a few years ago a big immigration project and refugee project in 8 countries. And the project was about creating a space that didn't exist in the world, that could only be created through the arts. And that was a space of truth, because the immigration debate, quote unquote, is again like the drug debate, quote unquote. There is no debate. And none of the basis is real coming from either side. That is to say, very simply, if you're coming to the United States, you know that we only accept one of 3 stories. So whatever your story was, you have to tell one of the 3 stories to get in. Meanwhile, an immigration judge has now so many lists of things that have to be checked off that whatever they think of the person they're interviewing is actually irrelevant. Because there are a whole series of categories that now just cut off the interview. So one of the intense things I tried to do was a production of Euripides' play The Children of Heracles, 25 centuries old, which is about Athens struggling with these issues. And what I did was invite people without papers and people in every chain of the immigration thing, border guards, lock up people in immigration detention centers, immigration judges, going all the way up through the head of Homeland Security. And then I had a journalist interview them. And every night before the performance, there was an encounter between somebody who chased illegal aliens and an illegal alien or 2. For me, the most important part of this was dinner beforehand that the public did not see. And what I did was create a dinner for these people, a nice dinner, every night. So the Minister of the Interior of Austria, a right-wing politician who's famous for locking them all up and throwing them all out, has dinner with 2 African refugees living in the streets of Vienna. They both have daughters. They talk about their daughters at dinner. Now, of course, most people have just never been with someone who's desperate and hiding and very vulnerable. And again, that shared space has not existed. So each have to imagine the other. And as we imagine the other, we imagine the worst. What does it mean when you do the most basic human thing, which is break bread with someone? and find out that you both have daughters. It changes you. The play, The Children of Heracles, we had to have a bunch of kids. So we got, in each country, unaccompanied minors is what they're called. They're kids who were picked up at the airport and so on, who are like the family in Africa saves, for however many years and sends one kid. Of course, they're picked up immediately when they get to the West and they're put in a detention center. So every night I had 27 of those kids on stage. And we gave them also a better meal than they got at the detention center. That was really important. And treated them as interesting, important people. And Euripides wrote the play in a really great way. The kids sit there all night looking at the audience, but the kids are never allowed to say anything because in an immigration hearing, your fate is being decided by other people. And so you look at those kids all night, and they look at you, which is Euripides' genius. And we have dinner for those kids before. And then at the end of the play, we invite the audience to go across the street from the theater, and they all have dinner that's been cooked by the refugees. And everybody breaks bread together. And finally, you're at a table with the kids who were on stage who you couldn't talk to and who couldn't talk. Just like that person at the bus stop who you didn't dare say anything to. You're finally having dinner with them. And what was really important for me was to have a space where an immigration judge and an immigrant could actually both speak honestly. Because that doesn't exist in real life. Neither of them can say what they actually are experiencing. It took an art project. Homeland Security said, oh, an art project, sure. And we could go through all the echelons. The Minister of the Interior of Austria said, oh, an art project, sure. The new right-wing government in Holland said, an art project, sure. And of course, Mr. Sarkozy in France couldn't stop himself. And theater became this strange safe zone where these warring parties could break bread and where truth could enter a picture that had previously only been lies. Some of the people without papers in America, in France, could not appear on stage. They were too frightened. It was very powerful to have an American audience sit there and have somebody speak to them from a microphone in a hidden room in the basement of the building. And say, we don't want your money, we want your freedom. Just to hear that in the room. To hear a refugee from Bosnia say the scary time was when all the flags started appearing on people's cars. To say that in America. That's just before the killing started, the flags started appearing everywhere. So part of the art project is it gives this space where something that's not allowed to be said can finally be said, or where the Minister of the Interior can become something other than a right-wing politician. Because they are something other than that. Because that is opposed like everything else. How do you give somebody the room to step out of the nightmare identity they've painted themselves into, or the world has painted them into? So, I'm going to read from the Upanishads because I really want to talk about food. And the reason I'm talking about food as culture is I'm talking about the food that you have and you're not hungry the next day. I'm talking about the meal you have and you can still taste 3 decades later because it changed your idea of who you are and what you could be, which is what culture does. In the Upanishads, and I'm going to read this a couple of times because it's very intense, the finest quality of curds, when churned, rises up as butter. This image of churning is very powerful in life, isn't it? Let's start that over again. The finest quality of curds, when churned, rises up as butter. The finest quality of food we swallow rises up as mind. The finest quality of food that we swallow rises up as mind. The finest quality of water we swallow rises up as life. The finest quality of water that we swallow rises up as life. The finest quality of the light we swallow. The finest quality of the light we swallow rises up as speech. The finest quality of the light we swallow rises up as speech. Remember, my daughter, mind comes from food, life comes from water, speech comes from light. Remember, my daughter, mind comes from food, life comes from water, speech comes from light. So this act of enlightened speech, this understanding that what we eat has to do with our quality of mind, is also connected to a deeper understanding of food, which is it's not to be bought and sold. And it is the result of sacrifice. That is to say, beings gave their lives so we could be on this earth for one more day. If you recognize that, plants, animals, that you're on earth for one more day because beings gave their lives. And we're part of a cycle of sacrifice. And the question is, what are the sacrifices we're making that acknowledge the sacrifices that have been made for one more day on earth? You suddenly start eating differently. You suddenly start recognizing water differently. And you begin to understand that our being is part of a complex interrelationship where food is not only not a commodity, it's the mind of your children. And eating well is about quality, not quantity. The finest quality. Each one of those sentences begins with the finest quality. It's all about the finest quality arriving as mind. the finest quality of the curds arrives as butter. The finest quality of the water. And the finest quality of the light arriving as speech. So, for me, one of the most important things with the food movement is putting this other piece in that's not about yuppies shopping at Whole Foods. And don't get me wrong, I'm not one of these anti-Whole Foods people. Thank God it's there for anyone who can afford to go in there. But I want to get to a much deeper question. And here, this will bring us back to the Boethius Institute. One of my favorite educational institutions in India is in Bhopal. Now, most of us know Bhopal because of the Union Carbide catastrophe and the generations of birth defects that continue. And again, corporate citizenship and the idea that things are more important than people. Also in Bhopal is the amazing Dagar brothers and family, who are the great Drupad singers. The lineage goes back 500 years. Drupad is the pre-Vedic form of Indian music, which is chanted in the voice, and there are no words, because words are understood to be imprecise. And so it's just pure tone. And of course, it's versions of this that are about the classical Indian discipline of healing through sound. And that sound is understood to have medical properties. And sound is understood to actually be capable of transforming a human being. This type of chanting has been in the dynasty of the Dagar family for centuries. And there are different Dagar brothers for every generation, of course. And I was fortunate to meet the Dagar brothers on one particularly strange week of my life in Europe. And I said, I just couldn't believe I was meeting them. And I said, oh my gosh, where are you coming from? And they said, we've just spent 4 months in Los Angeles. I said, oh, how strange to be in a city where everything's so fast, and your art form, because they chant very, very slowly across hours just on one tone. How can you practice this art form which is so slow in a city where everything is so fast? One of the brothers looked right through me with X-ray vision and said, Mr. Sellars, life is always slow. Only your mind is fast. And it's true. A tree growing, your child growing, anything that's actually happening in life is slow. Imperceptible. And so I said, well, I know they have a school, and I said, could you please tell me what you teach at this school, how you teach? The school in Bhopal is an amazing institution. The students get up at 3 in the morning, because that's when the low notes are very good. And, this incredible tradition all over the world is the chanting up of the dawn. In every religion, the pre-dawn prayer is the most important prayer of the day. How do you welcome a new day? What does it mean that we've been given a new page to work with? What does it mean that we have another chance? What does it mean that everything could be renewed? What does it mean that we could start again? What does it mean that we get one more day here? How do you prepare that day? How do you prepare yourself to enter it? And how do you make sure that day is not wasted, but it's welcomed and deeply fulfilled? And you recognize that everything you're not proud of yesterday, you have another chance today to maybe fix. The pre-dawn prayer is that most important preparation. It's the coldest, darkest time before the light appears. And it's how do you chant and welcome back the light that will become speech. They chant the low notes starting about 4 a.m. and moving up through the dawn at 6. They chant for a 4-hour arc, and then they cook breakfast. And the school is a cooking school. None of their students are supposed to take money for their art. What they will earn money doing is cooking. And they can feed people, literally. And I just want to end tonight with an example for Clarissa of an artist who I really love, working in Kansas City right now, and he's really old now. He just turned 25 last week. And to me, it's like a really beautiful example of the way the arts are working in a classical Indian manner. Classical Indian manner, I mean, that is to say, handcraft, care, love in every stitch, meaning in every stitch, patience, endurance, imagination, strength, play, thought, and tenderness. This artist's name is Sean Starwitz, and he and a group of his friends graduated from art school and had to just go into action. Some of their projects have been some of my favorite things. They did one project where they went dumpster diving all over Kansas City, and they got broken furniture. And they made all this furniture into artists' single, one-of-a-kind artist pieces. The fourth leg of a chair suddenly became this amazing piece of sculpture. Or a table became an amazing creative table of an artist making something out of a piece of junk that turned into a valuable, amazing act of imagination and reclamation, recovery, and renewal. They opened a store on Trost Avenue, which is the avenue that divides black from white Kansas City, and put all their furniture there for anyone to come in. And when you came in to buy a piece of furniture, amazing, crazy, beautiful artist furniture, they would not accept money. They would only accept barter. And you had to decide how many rides in your pickup truck that chair was worth, how many chicken dinners, and you bartered. So people who had no money could actually be part of the exchange. And it was about understanding the non-cash economy, which is the real economy that has always worked as long as the world has existed. It's the economy represented by women throughout all of history, which is you work very hard and you're paid nothing. But very deeply, if we can honor the late Howard Zinn, who said, you know, whatever freedom or democracy exists in the world did not come from people who had jobs. It came from people out on the picket line, from the people standing in front of the White House, not the people in the White House. And if you look at the things you do in your life that nobody pays you to do, they're the things that are important in your life to you, and the things that define who you are and what kind of person you are and what you care about. Every single thing you're not paid for is the most important part of your life. Could we start to honor the non-cash economy? Could we start to recognize that that's who we are? Not the cash economy, but the non-cash economy is who we really are, and the reason there is still life on Earth. Sean and his friends also have started an amazing project where they cook dinner once a month in a different neighborhood of Kansas City. And they it's been going now for 3.5 years. So artisan farmers and food providers are now donating stuff. So these dinners are super high-end, fabulous, fabulous food. And you buy a ticket to go, and the dinner is like 100 people. And every dinner, 4 artists present their work. And at the end of the evening, the people who have dined vote on which artist takes the evening's proceeds. And meanwhile, you've met 3 other artists you didn't know. They've been doing that for 3.5 years, every month in Kansas City, neighborhood to neighborhood. And in their generation, they've created a completely new set of communities. New set of people in touch, new set of people who are aware of what each other are doing. And in their generation have started to build, yes, a society of sharing and mutual support. This was the reaction when the governor of Missouri eliminated the State Arts Council. They said, well, we have to have a new granting process, and it might as well be more democratic than the old one. And then their newest thing is a set of, well, there are 2 new things right now that are going on. One is performances in laundromats throughout the city on Friday nights. And the performances are timed with wash cycles and with dry cycles. And the happening place to be in Kansas City Friday nights is laundromats. The laundromats are, many of them owned by the same Nigerian family. And so it turned into a major African art project. And now, in the food desert of East Kansas City, they've started a series of pop-up bakeries where kids can have fresh bread and make fresh bread and understand what it is in neighborhoods where there are only convenience stores to actually eat well, organic, fresh bread, which improves the quality of mind and eventually the quality of speech. Have a beautiful night.